Vincent Hayes sat motionless on the wooden bench beside the Hudson River, his expensive charcoal suit doing nothing to shield him from the December cold that seeped through fabric and skin straight into his bones. Around him, New York City blazed with Christmas lights, families laughing as they passed with shopping bags and hot cocoa, but he existed in a different dimension entirely, one where sound came muffled and colors appeared drained of meaning. In his trembling hands, he held two pieces of paper that represented the complete destruction of everything he had built over 15 years, the sale agreement for MindLink Technologies and a handwritten letter he had composed 3 hours earlier, explaining to no one in particular why the world would be better without him in it. When success becomes a prison. 2 years ago, Vincent Hayes had been profiled in Forbes as the genius who would revolutionize mental health treatment through technology. MindLink had developed neural interface software that helped people with depression, anxiety, and trauma process their emotions in ways traditional therapy could not reach. He had money, influence, respect, and most importantly, he had Natalie, his wife of 8 years, a pediatric surgeon whose laugh could fill a room and whose hands could heal broken bodies with the same grace she used to hold his face when he worried too much about quarterly reports. They had been trying for a baby, planning a vacation to Greece, talking about buying a house upstate where they could escape the city noise. Life had been a carefully constructed masterpiece of happiness, and then in one afternoon, it shattered into pieces so small he could never hope to reassemble them. The day everything ended. Natalie had been at the hospital when she collapsed during a routine surgery. An undiagnosed heart condition, the doctors explained later, a ticking clock hidden inside her chest that no one knew existed until it simply stopped. Vincent had been in a board meeting, discussing profit margins, when his phone rang with the call that divided his existence into before and after. He remembered the fluorescent hospital lights, the sympathetic eyes of the emergency room doctor, the way his knees buckled when they said she did not make it, the particular quality of silence that follows those words. On her phone, which they handed to him in a plastic bag with her other belongings, he found an unsent text message she had started typing just before her collapse. It read simply, "I have something important to tell you tonight. Something wonderful." He would never know what she meant, and that not knowing became a wound that would not close, a question that poisoned every thought that followed. The slow descent into darkness. After Natalie's funeral, Vincent tried to continue as if momentum alone could carry him through grief. He threw himself into work with manic intensity, sleeping in his office, attending meetings with hollow eyes, making decisions that sounded reasonable but came from a mind that had stopped caring about consequences. His therapist, David Wells, prescribed medication and talked about processing trauma, but Vincent simply added the pills to his morning routine without feeling any different, going through the motions of healing without actually healing. Julian Torres, his business partner and childhood friend, stepped in to handle more of the company operations, and Vincent felt grateful for the help, too exhausted to notice the small changes happening around him, contracts being modified, financial statements showing numbers that did not quite match reality, board members being replaced with people loyal to Julian rather than to the company's original mission. The betrayal hidden in plain sight. By December, federal investigators had begun asking questions about MindLink's financial practices, and Vincent discovered too late that Julian had been systematically embezzling funds, falsifying research data, and positioning himself to take control of the entire company. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss because Julian had been there the night Vincent met Natalie at a mutual friend's party, had been the best man at their wedding, had held Vincent when he sobbed at her funeral, and apparently all of that meant nothing compared to money and power. 3 days before Christmas, the board gave Vincent an ultimatum: either sign away majority control to Julian in exchange for immunity from the investigation, or face potential criminal charges for negligence in oversight. Vincent signed, not because he believed he was guilty, but because he could not find enough reason to care about fighting for a future that felt like punishment. That evening, he walked to the river with clear intention, having researched the water temperature, the survival rates, the likelihood of being found before hypothermia finished what despair had started. He stood at the edge where concrete met water, counting his heartbeats like a goodbye, when a voice broke through the static in his mind, soft but absolutely certain in its conviction. "Please don't do that. You look like someone who matters to somebody." He turned and saw a young woman in a bright red delivery jacket, her dark hair escaping from a ponytail, her brown eyes reflecting the Christmas lights from across the water. She held an insulated food bag against her chest like a shield, her breath visible in the cold air, and she looked terrified but determined, as if she had stumbled into saving a life and decided to see it through despite her fear. The moment that changed 2 lives. Clara Bennett had been delivering food orders for 12 hours straight, trying to earn enough for her mother's medication and her spring semester tuition at community college, when she saw a man in an expensive suit standing too close to the edge of the river with the particular stillness that comes before a final decision. Everything in her practical mind told her to keep walking, to not get involved, to let professionals handle things beyond her control, but something in the defeated slope of his shoulders reminded her of her father the week before he died, and she found herself speaking before thinking through consequences. She told Vincent that dying alone on Christmas Eve seemed like the saddest thing imaginable, that whatever had broken inside him might not be beyond repair, that tomorrow might be different even if today felt impossible. She spoke without polish or training, just honest human concern from someone who understood that pain does not discriminate based on bank account balances. The beginning of something unexpected. Vincent lowered himself back onto the bench, and Clara sat beside him, setting down her delivery bag even though her phone kept buzzing with order notifications. They did not exchange names at first, just sat together while snow began to fall in soft, lazy spirals, covering the city in temporary forgiveness. She told him about her mother's illness, her dream of becoming a social worker, her belief that most people are doing their best with impossible situations. He found himself talking about Natalie, the unsent message, the way grief makes every morning feel like climbing a mountain with no summit, and Clara listened without offering empty platitudes, just nodding as if she understood that sometimes being heard matters more than being fixed. When she finally had to leave to complete her deliveries, she wrote her number on a napkin from her bag and told him to call her tomorrow, not as a professional intervention but as a human being extending basic kindness to another. Vincent watched her walk away into the snowfall, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt something besides numbness, a small flicker of curiosity about what tomorrow might bring if he chose to see it. Vincent woke on Christmas morning to sunlight cutting through his penthouse windows like an accusation, the kind of brightness that makes a hangover worse, except he had not been drinking, just existing in the particular exhaustion that follows a night when you choose to keep breathing instead of stopping. His body ached as if he had run a marathon, every muscle tight with the tension of a decision reversed at the last possible moment. The napkin with Clara's number sat on his nightstand, the ink slightly smudged from snow, and he stared at it for 20 minutes before finally reaching for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, composing and deleting messages, trying to find words that could bridge the gap between a man who had almost died and a stranger who had stopped him. Finally, he typed something simple. "Thank you for last night. I am still here because of you." He pressed send before he could overthink it, then sat in the silence of his apartment, surrounded by furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his entire life. The girl who carried the world. Clara's phone buzzed while she was changing her mother's bedsheets, the morning routine that had become as familiar as breathing over the past 3 years since the diagnosis. Lupus had stolen her mother's strength gradually, turning a woman who once worked 2 jobs and sang while cooking into someone who needed help with basic tasks, whose good days meant being able to sit up without pain. Clara read Vincent's message while her mother dozed in the recliner, and she felt relief flood through her chest because she had spent half the night wondering if she had done enough, if her words had mattered, if he had survived until morning. She texted back while heating up leftover soup for their Christmas lunch. "I am glad you are still here. That takes real courage." She did not know who he was, had not recognized the expensive suit or the watch that probably cost more than her annual income, only saw a human being in crisis and responded the way Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor, had taught her to respond when Clara was just a child dealing with her father's sudden death from a heart attack. The lesson of kindness. Mrs. Chen had found 8-year-old Clara sitting on the apartment building steps, crying because her father had died that morning and she did not understand why good people had to leave when the world still needed them. The old woman had sat beside her without speaking at first, just being present in the way that matters more than words, and then she told Clara something that stayed with her through every hard year that followed. When someone is drowning, you do not ask if they deserve to be saved. You reach out your hand because you have a hand to reach. That is what makes us human instead of just bodies taking up space. Clara had carried that philosophy through her father's funeral, through her mother's diagnosis, through nights when she worked 3 jobs to pay medical bills, through semesters when she fell asleep during lectures because exhaustion lived in her bones. She had learned that kindness was not about having extra to give but about giving anyway, about seeing suffering and responding even when your own life felt impossibly heavy. The man who lost everything twice. Vincent spent Christmas Day in his therapist's emergency session, sitting in David Wells' home office because the man had insisted on seeing him after Vincent left a voicemail explaining what almost happened by the river. David listened without judgment as Vincent described standing at the edge, feeling the pull of the water, hearing Clara's voice cut through his despair. The therapist leaned forward, his expression serious in a way that cut through the usual professional distance. Vincent, you have been surviving instead of living for 2 years. Natalie's death was not your fault. Julian's betrayal was not your fault. But what you do with this second chance, that becomes your responsibility. Vincent wanted to argue, to explain how the guilt felt like concrete in his stomach, how every morning he woke up remembering that Natalie was gone and he was still here, how that felt wrong in a fundamental way. But David's words settled into him anyway, uncomfortable and true, a seed planted in soil that had been frozen for too long. The unraveling of empire. The day after Christmas, Vincent received a call from his lawyer, Patricia Monroe, a sharp woman who had been handling the sale of MindLink and trying to minimize his legal exposure. Her voice carried an edge of excitement that Vincent had not heard in months. Vincent, do not sign anything else. We found something. Over the next hour, she explained that a junior accountant at MindLink, someone Julian had recently fired, had come forward with evidence showing the extent of the fraud, emails proving Julian had deliberately falsified data, hidden offshore accounts, documentation of bribes paid to secure government contracts. The betrayal was deeper than Vincent had imagined, going back at least 5 years, meaning Natalie might have discovered something before her death, might have been trying to tell him something important that night she never got to come home. The thought made Vincent's hands shake with anger and grief tangled together until he could not separate them. The text that changed direction. Vincent texted Clara that afternoon, not because he had any right to her time but because something about her presence had made him feel less alone in his own skin. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? I would like to thank you properly. She agreed, suggesting a diner near her apartment in Queens because she had a shift starting at 6 and could spare an hour before work. Vincent arrived early, sitting in a vinyl booth that had probably been there since the 1980s, surrounded by people who looked tired in the way that comes from working hard for not enough money, and he realized this was the first time in years he had been somewhere that felt real instead of carefully curated for people with wealth. When Clara walked in wearing jeans and a sweater with a small hole in the sleeve, her hair pulled back and her face free of makeup, she looked more beautiful to him than anyone he had seen in the polished rooms of charity galas and business dinners. They talked for 2 hours instead of 1, Clara texting her manager to say she would be late, Vincent forgetting about the conference call he was supposed to join. She told him about studying social work because she wanted to help families like hers, people who fell through the cracks of systems designed to help but often failed in practice. He told her about MindLink's original mission, how they had wanted to make mental health care accessible and effective, how that dream had been corrupted by greed and ambition. Clara listened the way good listeners do, asking questions that showed she understood what he was not saying as much as what he was. When he mentioned Natalie's unsent message, the wondering that haunted him, Clara reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. Maybe she was going to tell you she was proud of you. Or maybe she found a perfect recipe for pancakes. The not knowing is hard, but it does not mean the something was bad. Let yourself imagine it might have been wonderful. The realization of shared humanity. Vincent looked at Clara and saw someone who understood loss differently than his therapist or his wealthy friends ever could, because she lived with it every day in practical ways, measuring medication doses and counting dollars and making choices between her education and her mother's comfort. She had not stopped to help him because she thought he was important or because she wanted something in return, but simply because she saw a person in pain and responded with the humanity that should be automatic but somehow rarely is. He asked her about her dreams beyond the immediate survival, and she talked about opening a community center someday, a place where people could get help with housing applications and food assistance and mental health support without feeling ashamed. Her eyes lit up when she described it, the same way his eyes used to light up when he talked about the early days of MindLink, before everything became about profit margins and investor presentations. The offer born from gratitude. Vincent made a decision then, sitting in a diner booth with coffee that had gone cold, that felt more right than anything he had decided in 2 years. I want to help you finish college. Full tuition, books, living expenses so you do not have to work 3 jobs. Let me do this, not as charity but as investment in someone who will actually change lives instead of just talking about it. Clara's immediate response was to refuse, pride and independence warring in her expression, but he pressed on. You saved my life. The least I can do is make yours a little easier while you save others. She sat quietly for a long moment, and he could see her calculating, probably thinking about her mother's medication costs and the community college classes she had been taking one at a time because she could not afford a full course load. Finally, she nodded slowly, tears shining in her eyes. Okay. But I pay you back someday, when I have my center running. Vincent smiled for the first time since Natalie died, a real smile that reached his eyes. Deal. The partnership of healing. Over the following weeks, Vincent and Clara fell into an unexpected friendship that neither had been looking for but both desperately needed. He helped her apply to a 4-year university with a strong social work program, covering application fees and coordinating with financial aid offices. She invited him to have dinner with her mother, where he sat in their small apartment eating homemade enchiladas and laughing at stories about Clara's childhood that made him remember what normal life felt like before wealth had isolated him in luxury. Clara's mother, Rosa, treated him with the same warmth she showed everyone, not caring about his money or his company, just grateful that someone was helping her daughter reach for dreams that had seemed impossible. Vincent found himself visiting their apartment more often than his penthouse, drawn to the realness of their lives, the way they existed without pretense or performance. The battle for justice. Meanwhile, Patricia worked on building a case against Julian, gathering evidence and coordinating with federal investigators who were now very interested in the full scope of the fraud. Vincent met with them, providing testimony and documentation, feeling something close to purpose returning as he fought to reclaim what Julian had stolen, not just money but the integrity of a company built to help people. The investigation revealed that Julian had been planning his takeover for years, systematically replacing board members and key employees with people loyal to him, falsifying research results to secure funding, creating shell companies to hide the stolen money. The betrayal was calculated and complete, and Vincent felt anger replace numbness, which his therapist said was actually progress because anger meant he cared enough to feel something. On New Year's Eve, Vincent stood on a different riverbank with Clara beside him, watching fireworks bloom across the sky in colors that reflected off the water. She had finished her last delivery shift an hour earlier, and he had picked her up in his car, driving through the city as people celebrated around them. They did not speak much, just stood together in comfortable silence, and Vincent realized that Clara had become his anchor, the person who reminded him that life could still hold meaning if he looked for it in the right places. She glanced at him as the clock struck midnight, smiling that quiet smile that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. You made it. You are still here. Vincent nodded, feeling the weight of that truth, the miracle of survival, the possibility that maybe tomorrow could be different if he let it. January arrived with bitter cold and the kind of clarity that comes after surviving what should have killed you, and Vincent found himself sitting in a federal courtroom watching Julian Torres being led in wearing an orange jumpsuit that stripped away the expensive suits and false charm. The trial had moved quickly once the evidence became overwhelming, bank records showing millions funneled into offshore accounts, emails discussing how to manipulate research data, testimony from employees Julian had threatened into silence. Vincent sat in the gallery beside Patricia, his hands folded in his lap, feeling none of the satisfaction he thought he would feel seeing his former friend face consequences. Instead, he felt sad for the waste of it all, how greed had turned someone he once loved like a brother into a stranger willing to destroy everything they had built together. During a recess, Julian caught his eye across the courtroom and mouthed something that looked like an apology, but Vincent simply looked away because some betrayals run too deep for forgiveness to reach. The company reborn. With Julian's fraud exposed and the legal ownership restored through emergency court orders, Vincent faced the enormous task of rebuilding MindLink from the inside out. He spent long days in the office reviewing every contract, every research project, every employee, trying to separate what was real from what Julian had manufactured. The board of directors, now cleared of Julian's planted allies, offered Vincent full control again, but he surprised everyone by proposing a different structure. He wanted to restructure the company as a benefit corporation, legally committed to social good over pure profit, with a board that included mental health professionals and patient advocates alongside business experts. Some investors pulled out immediately, unwilling to accept reduced returns, and Vincent let them go without argument because he remembered why he started this company in the first place, to help people who were suffering, not to make himself richer than any person needed to be. The scholarship that multiplied. Clara started at Columbia University's social work program in January, and Vincent established something he called the Second Chance Scholarship Fund in Natalie's name, designed to support students like Clara who had talent and determination but lacked financial resources. He put $10 million into the initial fund, planning to add more each year, and personally reviewed applications alongside a committee Clara helped him assemble. She brought perspective he would never have alone, understanding which stories reflected real struggle versus which ones simply sounded good on paper. They worked together in his office some evenings, Vincent in his chair reviewing financial projections while Clara sat cross-legged on the couch reading case studies for her classes, and there was something peaceful about the shared space that reminded him distantly of working alongside Natalie, though different, its own thing entirely. Rosa Bennett, watching her daughter's life transform in ways she had prayed for but never expected, invited Vincent to dinner one evening in early February with a specific purpose in mind. After they finished eating, she sent Clara to the store for dessert they did not actually need, creating space to speak plainly. "Vincent, I need you to understand something important. My daughter has a heart bigger than her common sense sometimes. She saved your life because that is who she is, but you need to be careful with her feelings. She talks about you constantly, worries about you like you are family, and I can see something growing there that could hurt her badly if you do not feel the same way." Vincent met Rosa's direct gaze and saw a mother protecting her child the way Natalie would have protected theirs if they had been given the chance. "I care about Clara deeply. She gave me a reason to keep living when I could not find one myself. But I am still broken in ways I do not know how to fix, and the last thing I want is to cause her pain." Rosa softened slightly, her expression shifting from protective to understanding. "Loving someone who died does not mean you died too. Natalie would want you to live fully, not just survive. I lost my husband when Clara was young, and I spent years thinking being loyal to his memory meant being alone. Then I realized the best way to honor him was to keep finding joy, because he loved seeing me happy. You think about that." When Clara returned with ice cream, she found them laughing about something her mother had said about Vincent's terrible Spanish pronunciation, and she looked between them with suspicion but also relief that they were getting along. Vincent drove home that night thinking about Rosa's words, how they echoed things David had been trying to tell him for months, how maybe the weight he carried was not actually what Natalie would have wanted him to bear. The discovery in old files. In March, while cleaning out boxes of Natalie's belongings he had stored in a closet untouched for 2 years, Vincent found her personal journal tucked inside a medical textbook. His hands shook as he opened it, seeing her handwriting, small and precise, filling pages with thoughts about patients and politics and their life together. He almost closed it, afraid of what intimacy with her words might do to the fragile stability he had built, but something made him keep reading until he reached the final entry, dated the morning of the day she died. She had written about discovering she was pregnant, just 6 weeks along, wanting to confirm it with her doctor before telling Vincent, planning to surprise him that evening with the news that they were going to be parents. The wonderful thing she had wanted to tell him, the message she never got to send, was about the baby they would never meet. The grief that finally broke. Vincent sat on the floor of his bedroom surrounded by her clothes and books and the journal open to those final words, and he cried in a way he had not cried since the funeral, deep sobs that came from a place he had kept locked because opening it felt too dangerous. He called Clara without thinking, and she came immediately even though it was past midnight, letting herself in with the spare key he had given her for emergencies. She found him still on the floor and simply sat beside him, not trying to fix anything or make it better, just being present while he grieved for Natalie and for the child who never got to exist and for the life that had been stolen by random medical chance. She held his hand while he talked about the pregnancy, about how Natalie must have been so happy that morning at the hospital, about how she died not knowing he would have been the happiest man alive to hear that news. Clara cried with him, understanding that some pain needs to be witnessed by another person before it can begin to heal. The shift in understanding. Over the following weeks, something changed in how Vincent carried his grief, becoming less like a burden that crushed him and more like a weight he had learned to balance. He still missed Natalie with an ache that lived in his chest, still thought about her every day, but the missing had transformed from something that made him want to stop existing into something that reminded him she had been real and their love had mattered. He started working with MindLink's research team again, getting involved in developing new protocols for treating complicated grief, using his own experience to inform better approaches. The company launched a new program offering free therapy to people who had lost partners suddenly, and Vincent sat in on some of the groups, sharing his story when it felt appropriate, finding purpose in helping others navigate the same darkness that had nearly consumed him. The moment of recognition. In April, Clara invited him to a presentation she was giving for one of her classes about barriers to mental health care in low-income communities, and Vincent sat in the university lecture hall watching her speak with confidence and passion about systemic failures and possible solutions. She cited research and personal experience, talking about her mother's struggle to get adequate care, about her own difficulty accessing therapy after her father's death, about how the current system was designed in ways that excluded the people who needed help most desperately. Watching her, Vincent felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had been building for months but only now became clear. He was falling in love with Clara Bennett, not as a replacement for Natalie but as something entirely new, loving her fierce intelligence and practical kindness and the way she moved through the world expecting to make it better through sheer force of caring. The realization terrified him because loving again meant risking loss again, meant acknowledging that Natalie was truly gone instead of just temporarily absent, meant choosing to build a future instead of living in the past. He talked about it with David during their next session, pacing the office while trying to explain the guilt that came with feeling happy, the sense that he was betraying Natalie by developing feelings for someone else. David listened patiently before responding in his measured way. "Vincent, Natalie is gone. That is a tragedy that nothing can change. But you are alive. You get to choose whether that life includes love and connection or whether you spend it punishing yourself for surviving. What do you think Natalie would want for you?" Vincent knew the answer, had always known it, but hearing the question out loud made it impossible to ignore. Natalie had been generous and loving and utterly opposed to unnecessary suffering. She would have wanted him to be happy, would have liked Clara immediately, would have probably plotted ways to push them together if she could. The confession by the river. In May, exactly 6 months after the night Clara had stopped him from jumping, Vincent took her back to the same bench by the river where everything had changed. The weather was warmer now, trees showing green instead of bare branches, the water reflecting late afternoon sunlight instead of Christmas lights. They sat together in the spot where he had contemplated ending his life, and he told her what he had been feeling, trying to be honest even though the words felt clumsy and inadequate. "You saved my life that night, but you have done something even more important since then. You have shown me that life can still be good, that I can still be a person who gives instead of just takes, that loving someone new does not erase loving someone who is gone. I am falling in love with you, Clara, and that terrifies me because I cannot survive losing someone again." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the water move past them, and when she spoke her voice carried the same certainty it had 6 months earlier. "I fell in love with you somewhere between that first night and now. But Vincent, I need you to understand something. I am not saving you anymore. You saved yourself when you decided to keep living. What we have now, that is 2 whole people choosing each other, not one person rescuing another." The kiss that meant beginning. Vincent leaned forward and kissed her softly, tasting salt from tears he had not realized were falling, feeling her hands come up to hold his face the way Natalie used to but different, Clara's touch entirely her own. When they pulled apart, she was smiling that quiet smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "So what happens now?" she asked, and he laughed because he had no idea, had not planned beyond this moment, had been so focused on whether he should tell her that he had not considered what came after. "I guess we figure it out together. Take it slow, see where it goes, try not to overthink it." Clara nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I can do slow. I have been doing slow my whole life, working toward things one step at a time. This does not have to be different." They sat together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that reminded Vincent that endings and beginnings often looked the same, depending on which direction you were facing. The center that rose from ashes. Over the summer, Vincent worked with Clara to make her dream of a community center real, purchasing a building in her Queens neighborhood and funding renovations that transformed it into a space offering mental health services, job training, legal aid, and food assistance. They called it the Natalie Hayes Community Center, and Vincent found deep meaning in creating something good from his grief, turning his wife's memory into something that would help people every single day. Clara worked there part-time while continuing her studies, and Vincent visited often, sometimes leading workshops on coping with loss, sometimes just sitting in on community meetings and learning about problems he had never encountered in his wealthy bubble. He met people who reminded him that suffering was not unique to the rich, that loss and struggle came for everyone regardless of bank balance, that the common thread connecting all humans was vulnerability and the need for connection. On Christmas Eve, 1 year after the night everything changed, Vincent and Clara returned to the bench with Rosa and a small group of friends they had gathered along the way. They brought candles and flowers, and Vincent spoke about Natalie, sharing stories about her laugh and her terrible singing voice and the way she believed deeply that everyone deserved kindness. He talked about almost dying in that spot, about how Clara's words had cut through his despair, about how the past year had taught him that surviving tragedy was not about forgetting the people you lost but about honoring them by living fully. Clara spoke too, talking about her father and the lessons about reaching out your hand when someone is drowning, about how helping Vincent had reminded her why she wanted to do this work in the first place. They lit candles that flickered in the winter breeze, small flames that refused to go out despite the cold, and Vincent thought about resilience, about how humans keep finding ways to create light even in the darkest moments. The future written in hope. As they walked back through the city together, Clara's hand warm in his, Vincent thought about all the things that had to break before they could begin to heal, how sometimes surviving means letting go of who you thought you would be and discovering who you actually are beneath the grief. MindLink was thriving again under ethical leadership, helping people without exploiting them. The scholarship fund had supported 30 students in its first year, giving opportunities to people like Clara who would use them to change the world in small, persistent ways. The community center served hundreds of families every month, providing support that should have been available all along but rarely was. And Vincent himself had transformed from a man who wanted to die into someone who woke up grateful for each morning, not because the pain had disappeared but because he had learned to carry it alongside joy instead of letting it consume everything else. He looked at Clara, seeing her profile lit by streetlights, and felt something he had not felt since before Natalie died. He felt lucky to be alive, lucky to have found love twice in one lifetime, lucky that a poor girl in a delivery jacket had cared enough to stop a stranger from making a permanent decision. Some stories end in darkness, but this one ended in light, imperfect and hard one, but real enough to build a life on, one day at a time, together. The end.